all right. I know we need to talk because I was supposed to have an episode recorded and ready for first thing this morning. Listen, I had a plan. I had a schedule. I had that little illusion of adulthood where you're like, yeah, I'm a responsible human. I run a show. I do deadlines. And then Capcom dropped Resident Evil Requiem and it turned me into a goblin. And not like a cute goblin either. Like a full headphones welded to my fucking skull goblin. I'm serious. I had my phone face down on my desk. I was ignoring group chats. People were texting me like, dude, are you alive? And I was just like, bro, I can't talk right now. The girl is in the hallway. Which, taken out of context, sounds like I'm narrating a haunted orphanage. But in context, it's still very much insane. But at least I have lore. So, if you're listening to this and thinking, Nate, why is the schedule a little out of whack? Well, it's because Requiem sank its claws into me and did not let go. And the wild part? I don't even play horror games like that. Let me explain. You see, I respect horror games. I admire them. I think they're art. But when something starts whispering in surround sound and I've got 3 bullets and severe anxiety, I'm just like, yep, y'all have a good one. Uninstall. Deleted. Cleanse the hard drive. I do not need recreational trauma. Hell, I'm already paying bills. But this game, even when I was the most stressed I have ever been, I never quit. I locked in. So, welcome to, or welcome back to, the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe. And today, I want to do something just a little different. This is a review episode, but not an IGN-coded review. I'm not scoring it, I'm not doing the graphics 9.2, sound 8.7, water physics 14. Absolutely not. Think of this as your bro who just beat a game and needs to grab you by the shoulders and go, listen to me. I gotta tell you what this did to me. And since Resident Evil Requiem is taking the franchise through its legacy, well, I figured why don't we just do the same thing? If you've listened to any of our other episodes where I've talked about how Average Joe Nerdcast came to be, then you know this all started as a video game blog, where myself and Ian would occasionally review video games. So I figured, let's do it. So here's what I want to do. I want to talk about why Requiem locked me in harder than literally anything since Red Dead Redemption 2. I want to talk about Grace's horror sections, because that's where I experienced true terror. I want to talk about Leon's sections, and how they refine the action side without making you feel like a superhero. I want to celebrate the fact that Capcom is 30 years deep and still proving why this franchise has lasted. And if you're new to Resident Evil, I'm going to give you a quick, hey, play these first kind of roadmap so you can appreciate what Requiem is evolving. And just so we're grounded, Capcom itself positions Resident Evil Requiem as the 9th mainline entry. All right, how about we get into it? First and foremost, I need to clear up what I meant when I said I don't play horror games, because I absolutely have played survival horror. I've always put survival horror in a different mental bucket than traditional horror. You see, survival horror to me is usually tension, resource management, puzzles, and that constant low-key stress where you're doing inventory math like you're filing taxes in the pits of hell. Sure, it's scary, but it's not usually paralyzing. It's not usually I froze and stopped moving. And Requiem changed that. And the first time I truly understood what kind of game I was in was Grace's section at Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center. Now, critics have been calling Rhodes Hill one of the best designed locations in the series in a long time. The Washington Post straight up described it as the best designed Resident Evil location in decades. And I completely get why. Because Rhodes Hill isn't scary because something jumps out at you every 3 seconds. It's scary because the environment is doing violence to your nervous system. The darkness is oppressive, but not in a cheap way. The lighting is wrong. That subtle red emergency glow, it's like your eyes can see shapes, but your brain can't finish the sentence. And then there's the storm outside. And I really don't know how else to say it. That storm is a weapon. Because when thunder is cracking and wind is slapping windows, your brain cannot separate. Wait a minute, was that outside? Or was that right behind me? So you're constantly half turning like a paranoid raccoon. And then you have your very first encounter with the girl. And I froze. Like, seriously, full stop, controller in my hands, did not move. Not, I paused to think about my life choices. I straight up froze like my body was buffering. And then I did what any brave and courageous grown man would do. I panic ran my ass to the only room with a light on. Because light is her weakness. And I stayed in that room for longer than I care to admit. Like, I'm not even going to pretend I popped in and out like a hero. No, sir. I stayed there like, okay, Nate, breathe. You're fine. This is a video game. You're an adult. You have children. You pay your taxes. You can face. And then the wind blew a curtain from a window right down the hallway. And I was just like, well, you know what? I'm just going to live here now. This is my room. This is my home base. I'm starting a brand new life. And you know what's brilliant is this. The game doesn't teach you light is safety with a pop-up that says, hey, light is safety. It teaches you the way real fear teaches you, through instinct. That's why it landed for me. And that's also why it's cracking me up that some folks are out here acting shocked that the survival horror game is horrifying. Because, yes, there's chatter from players in Steam discussions about getting refunds, and there are threads complaining it's just too scary, or tries too hard to be horror. But how about I put a bow on this? Overall on Steam, the game's sitting at overwhelmingly positive with a massive review count. So, it's not like the world is rejecting it. It's more like there's a subset of folks who walked into a haunted house and got mad the ghosts were mean to them. And I'm not even saying that to be a jerk. I'm just saying that's literally the point. Capcom has said, even in pre-release interviews, that they wanted to lean back into horror. And they even discussed adding options like a third-person mode because some people couldn't handle Resident Evil 7's intensity. So the fact that Requiem is scaring people? Dude, that's not a flaw. That's an absolute win. That's the franchise saying, yeah, dude, we still got it. And as someone who usually taps out when a game crosses the line from tense to genuinely terrifying, this is the first time I've been like, yes, I'm terrified, but I need to keep going. And that's rare. That's craft. That's Capcom understanding the psychology of fear. So in a way, Grace's sections break you down. They destabilize you. They make you question everything from doorways to shadows to noises. They make you cling to light like it's oxygen. And then the game pivots. It hands you control of Leon. Now, if you've been with this franchise for any amount of time, Leon S. Kennedy isn't just a character. He's a temperature shift. And I love that Requiem understands that. Because Leon's sections are not just, okay, here's the action mode. They're controlled evolution. Critics have pointed out that Requiem smartly splits its identity between two tones: pure survival horror and refined action horror, instead of trying to awkwardly blend them in the same breath. And that's exactly how it feels. Grace to me is suffocation. Leon is the release. But here's the key. You do not feel like a superhero. You just feel capable. And that difference matters. Leon's gameplay clearly builds on what the Resident Evil 4 remake smartly established: tight gunplay, responsive movement, enemy aggression that forces you to think on your feet. But Requiem doesn't let you become Doom Guy. You're not sprinting through hordes like you're invincible. Enemies can still pressure you, and your ammo still matters, and your positioning absolutely matters. You just feel trained, and that's where it really clicked for me, because by the end of the game, I knew Leon's controls so well that I felt untouchable. But not because the game gave me power, but because I earned mastery. That's an insanely satisfying arc. And this is where I think Requiem is smarter than people give it credit for. You see, Grace makes you freeze. Leon teaches you to move. Grace teaches you to survive. Leon teaches you to fight back. The game doesn't just scare you for 15 hours straight. It modulates. It understands horror fatigue is very, very real. It lets you breathe without ever fully relaxing. Because even in Leon's action-heavy sections, you're still not safe. You're just prepared. And that's a massive distinction. Now, let me just sit with this for a quick second. Because when I say by the end I felt untouchable, I don't mean the game broke. I mean I internalized the mechanics. I understood my spacing, I understood reload timing, I understood the enemy tells. And that empowerment is what makes the horror sections hit even harder. Because when you go from feeling helpless with Grace to feeling trained with Leon, you experience the full emotional spectrum. That's intentional pacing. That right there is design maturity. And a lot of outlets have used the word refinement when describing Requiem. Not reinvention, refinement. And that's not a knock. That's praise. Because after 30 years, a franchise doesn't need to reinvent itself every single time. It just needs to refine, to polish, to understand its identity, and respect its core DNA. Requiem doesn't abandon survival horror for action. It doesn't abandon action for horror. It orchestrates both. Grace channels the claustrophobic dread of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Leon refines the combat foundation laid out in Resident Evil 4 Remake. And somehow, it doesn't feel schizophrenic. It feels deliberate. And the real win? I never felt bored. Even in the slower horror segments, even in heavier combat segments, the pacing kept me locked in. And that's why this game wrecked my schedule. Because once I got into Leon sections, it was, okay, just one more encounter. And then an hour had passed. And then I'm texting my wife like, holy shit, Capcom cooked. And she's like, babe, you have a show to record. And I'm like, nah, not anymore, I don't. But real quick, let's zoom out for just a second. Resident Evil as a franchise has always had this tug of war between pure horror and action spectacle. You saw it swing one way with Resident Evil 1 and 2 and 3. Then it swung harder into action with Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. Then it swung back into horror with Resident Evil 7. And Requiem feels like the moment the pendulum steadied itself. It's not swinging wildly, it's perfectly balanced. And that balance is why this game works. And now that we've talked about atmosphere and horror and mechanics, we need to talk about the monsters. And I don't just mean the undead. Because one of the biggest things I've been quietly, and by quietly I mean aggressively hoping for, was a return to zombies. And Capcom delivered in spades. But they didn't just give us shamblers. They didn't just give us nostalgia and a trench coat. Wink, wink. They gave us evolution. So let's start with the return of zombies. Resident Evil without zombies always felt a little like pizza without the cheese. You can absolutely do it. You can experiment. You can throw parasites in there, you can throw mold in there, but zombies are the core DNA. And don't get me wrong. Yes, we have had incredible entries that leaned into different bio-horror concepts. Resident Evil 7 was phenomenal. The mold worked. The Baker family worked. But zombies? Man, that's legacy. And what Requiem does brilliantly is bring them back in a way that's not just, hey, remember 1998? These zombies retain fragments. They can use tools, they fire weapons, they speak, they sing, they perform basic tasks. And that's not comfort. That's uncanny valley horror. Because the scariest thing about a zombie isn't that it's dead. It's that something might still be in there, just beneath the surface. And Requiem leans into that. You'll walk into a room and see something performing an action, not mindlessly wandering, and your brain immediately goes, oh shit, that's worse. That's psychological horror layered on top of nostalgia. It's Capcom saying, you wanted zombies? Cool. Here's evolved trauma. Classic zombies like in Resident Evil 1 and 2 were terrifying because they were relentless and slow. But these, they're disturbing because they feel incomplete. There's muscle memory. There's behavioral echo. That suggests there's a tragedy under the monster. And horror that carries tragedy always lands deeper. And let me pivot carefully here. I want to talk about Victor Gideon, but no spoilers. But we can talk about presence. Victor Gideon feels like classic Resident Evil villain DNA modernized. There's a certain calculated composure there, a quiet menace. He's not cartoonish, he's not mustache twirling. He just feels deliberate. And that's something the franchise does incredibly well when it's firing on all cylinders. From corporate horror to bioweapon ambition, Resident Evil villains often embody control. Until they don't. Victor carries that same exact energy. And the way he's framed in Requiem, it feels earned, not forced. Okay, let's zoom out one more time. Because one of the most powerful things Resident Evil Requiem does, beyond the mechanics and beyond lighting and beyond the zombies, is this. It celebrates its own history. And not in a loud neon, hey, remember this kind of way, but in a confident, subtle, earned kind of way. And that totally matters. Because we're talking about a franchise that is 30 years old. Most franchises don't make it to 10 without losing their whole identity. Resident Evil has survived console generations, gameplay shifts, full tonal reboots, remakes of its own legacy, and cultural shifts in what horror even means. And Requiem feels like Capcom looking back at those 3 decades and going, hey, we remember too. Now, I'm not going to spoil specific reveals, but I definitely want to say this. There are a few moments in this game where if you've been with the franchise for all these years, you're going to sit up in your chair. And not because it's cheap nostalgia, because it's earned. Resident Evil has always had a long memory. Characters don't just disappear into the void. Events, they have consequences. And locations carry very deep scars. And Requiem taps into that. There are surprise returns, both in character presence and environmental callbacks that feel like love letters to longtime fans. It's never pandering, it's just love letters to us. But there is one thing we can absolutely talk about. Because when you step back into the ruins of Raccoon City, brother, that's sacred ground. And when those subtle music cues from Resident Evil 2 start drifting in when you enter the RPD, it doesn't scream at you, just whispers. It's the kind of callback that only hits if you've been there before. If you've walked those halls 100 times, if you've heard that save room music, if you've fought through that building with limited ammo and shaking hands. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it seriously felt like walking through a graveyard of my childhood. And I was grinning ear to ear the entire time. Because it wasn't just, hey, remember this building? It was, this totally mattered. And it still does. And you know what's rare? Especially nowadays? A franchise that respects its own timeline. A franchise that doesn't constantly reboot itself into irrelevance. Resident Evil doesn't pretend the past didn't happen. It just builds upon it. Requiem doesn't erase the legacy of Resident Evil 2, or 3, or Resident Evil 4, or Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, or Resident Evil Village. It synthesizes them. That's the word that keeps coming back to me. Synthesis. Not reinvention, not abandonment, just synthesis. And let's just sit in this for a second. 30 years. How many franchises can you name that reinvented third-person action, survived the everything must be multiplayer era, pivoted to first-person horror, then pivoted back, and are still getting overwhelmingly positive reception? Requiem didn't just land with the critics. It smashed Steam concurrency records for the franchise within hours of release. That's not nostalgia, Carrie. That's relevance. That's perfect execution. That's Capcom understanding tone, pacing, and audience expectations. And here's the big point. Resident Evil has lasted because it knows when to evolve and when to return to its roots. Requiem is the proof. Grace channels the suffocating dread of Resident Evil 7. Leon refines the action evolution that started with Resident Evil 4. The zombies reconnect to the emotional weight of the first trilogy, and the legacy callbacks remind you, this world has history, and you've survived it. And dude, that is powerful. Okay, so let's say you're listening to this episode and thinking to yourself, Nate, all of this sounds incredible, but I've never really played Resident Evil like that. First of all, hey, how are you? Welcome. If you choose to play it, you have a whole mess of trauma to get through. And second of all, you absolutely can jump straight into Requiem. It stands on its own mechanically. But you will appreciate it 100 times more if you experience the DNA first. So I figured I'd throw together a quick roadmap, not the full franchise gauntlet, but just the core evolution for any new players to check out. Start with Resident Evil, even if you just play the remake version. This is the blueprint. This is claustrophobic design, limited resources, environmental storytelling, that creeping dread of, do I open this door? Requiem's grace sections, they channel this energy. that fragility, that sense that you're not built for what's happening. And you'll see that lineage almost instantly. Then you go to Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. Again, you're more than welcome to stick with the remakes. This is where the world truly expands. Raccoon City becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a tragedy. You understand the outbreak, and you also understand the consequences. And when Requiem takes you back there, it'll hit you different, because you've been there before. It's not just a cool ruined city. It's fundamental history. Then you hit Resident Evil 4 Remake. And this right here is the pivot. This is where the franchise said, what if horror had flow? Over-the-shoulder camera, precision aiming, crowd control combat. Without Resident Evil 4, Leon's sections and Requiem don't exist in the way they do. You don't get that empowered but not invincible feeling. Requiem refines what Resident Evil 4 revolutionized. Then play Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. This is where the franchise said, okay, enough action, let's scare the shit out of people again. First-person perspective, intimate horror, slow burn dread. Grace's Rhodes Hill section? Dude, that's got RE7 DNA all over it. The suffocation, the sound design, that sense of isolation. And when you experience those games first, you can see Resident Evil 1, fragility. Resident Evil 2 and 3, world consequence. Resident Evil 4, mechanical evolution. Resident Evil 7, horror recalibration. Requiem synthesizes all of it. It's not just a sequel, it's a culmination. And when you've walked through the Spencer Mansion, survived Raccoon City, watched Leon grow, endured Resident Evil 7's claustrophobia, Requiem feels like the franchise looking at you and going, hey kid, you made it. And that's powerful. So how about we really sit in this? Guys, 30 years. How many franchises from the 90s are still relevant today? And not nostalgia relevant, actually relevant. Resident Evil has reinvented third-person shooters, survived tonal shifts, weathered intense fan backlash, rebuilt trust after missteps and experimentation, and consistently delivered quality remakes. Requiem isn't coasting on brand recognition. It's earning its place. And the fact that it launched to massive player numbers and strong reception, that's not luck. That's execution. That's legacy maintained through evolution. And you know what I love most about all of this? Resident Evil never gets comfortable. It experiments all the time. It listens. It recalibrates. And Requiem feels like the moment all those experiments finally clicked. It feels confident, not desperate, not pandering, just confident. So let me bring this full circle, because now I've got New Game Plus to tackle. When I think about Resident Evil Requiem, I don't think about mechanics first. I don't think about a set piece. I don't even think about a particular boss fight. I think about that very first moment at Rhodes Hill. The red lights, the storm outside the windows, and the girl hunting me in the hallways. And there I was, frozen, my controller in hand, not moving, internally screaming. That's really not something I experience in games too often. Not anymore, at least. I've been playing games for decades. I know the language. I know the design tricks. I know when a scare is coming. And Requiem, it cut through all that. It bypassed the, hey, I've seen this kind of thing before filter, and it hit something instinctual. That is incredibly rare. That's craftsmanship. And what makes it even more impressive is what the game does next. It doesn't just leave you there in fear for 20 hours straight. It hands you Leon. It lets you grow. It lets you learn. It lets you internalize the mechanics. And by the end of it, I wasn't frozen anymore. I was moving. I was decisive. I was confident. That shift from prey to predator is intentional. Grace breaks you down. Leon builds you back up. That's not accidental pacing. That's emotional architecture. And then, like I said, you return to Raccoon City, back to the RPD, to those subtle music cues from RE2, and it hits you right in the chest. Because suddenly you're not just playing a sequel. You're standing in the aftermath of 3 decades. It felt like walking through a graveyard of my childhood, and I was grinning the entire time. Because it wasn't just fan service. It was paying respect to us longtime fans. It was the franchise acknowledging its past without being trapped by it. And that right there is maturity. Resident Evil started in 1996. 30 years later, it's still experimenting, refining, scaring the ever-loving shit out of people, breaking Steam records, sparking debates, and pushing design forward. That's not luck. That's stewardship. That's a developer that understands tone, pacing, and legacy. And to the people saying it's too scary, guys, that's the entire point. It's survival horror. If it didn't scare you, then it failed. The fact that some players are refunding it because it crossed that line, that tells me Capcom committed. They didn't water it down. They didn't play it safe. They trusted the genre, and they trusted its audience. And that's why I wholly respect it. So here's where I stand. If you love survival horror, play it. If you love Resident Evil, play it immediately. And if you're brand new, play Resident Evil 1, then 2, then 3, 4, and then 7. Then come back to Requiem and watch how it synthesizes the best parts of each era, because that's what it is. Not reinvention, culmination. Resident Evil Requiem scared the shit out of me. It humbled me. It trained me. And then it welcomed me home. It derailed my entire recording schedule. It stole my free time. It made me freeze in a hallway. And I loved every second of it. That's my honest take. No score, no decimals. Just your bro telling you, this one got me. Now, before I get out of here, you know I gotta show some love. Shout out to my player 2. Thank you for tolerating my red-lit descent into madness. And shout out to Ian for nerding out just as hard over this game as I have. And for being the definitive nativepedia of Capcom's survival horror masterpiece. And most importantly, shout out to each and every one of you. Seriously, if you've played Resident Evil Requiem, I want to hear your experiences. Did you freeze up like I did at Rhodes Hill, or are you just built different? Hit up the lobby on Facebook. That's the Average Joe Nerdcast private Facebook group. I'll leave the link in the episode description, or you can head straight over to Facebook and in the search bar, just type Average Joe Nerdcast, the lobby, and you will find the page. That's the place where the conversations keep going long after the episodes end. That's also where we debate, where we can share funny clips and memes, and that's where we collectively admit we panic ran to the nearest lit room. Because if I'm being honest, this show doesn't just end when the music fades away. It continues there. As always, the lobby, it's always open. And don't forget, stay gold, nerd bold, and I'll catch you on the next one. This episode of the Average Joe Nerdcast is brought to you by Rhodes Hill Emergency Lighting Solutions. Are you being stalked by a bioentity in a red-lit hallway? Is your current lighting solution ominous at best? Then upgrade today to Rhodes Hill Premium Fluorescent Protection, because darkness is no longer an atmosphere. It's a mechanic. With Rhodes Hill lighting, you can turn any horrifying medical facility into a moderately survivable workspace. Just use promo code I'm Frozen at checkout for 10% off your first existential crisis. Rhodes Hill Emergency Lighting Solutions. See your fear before it sees you.
Game over.